My name is Lisa Jackson-Pulver. I'm a Professor of Public Health and Director of the Murray Indigenous Health Unit at the University of New South Wales and Adjunct Professor here at the University of Canberra. I will be your MC today, and I'm deeply honoured to be asked to perform in this special role. First thing I'd like to do, though, is to pay my deepest respects to the custodians of this beautiful land on which we're meeting today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and to those who come. First, I'd like to introduce the University of Canberra's Vice-Chancellor, Professor Stephen Parker, who will formally acknowledge our ceremonies today. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Deputy Chancellor Dr. Tom Calma, distinguished guests, staff, alumni, students and friends, it's my great pleasure to add my own welcome and thanks to our MC, Professor Lisa Jackson-Pulver, our panel of speakers, and of course you, the audience. I'd like to do what we try always to do at important occasions at this university, particularly where people are coming from outside the university, which is to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people. I acknowledge that the land we are meeting on is land of which the Ngunnawal people are the traditional custodians. I send my respects to their elders past and present and to all Indigenous people here today. And we do this acknowledgement to the University and acknowledgement of country with particular focus since our Reconciliation Action Plan, which we entered into with deep commitment 2 years ago. The Ngunnawal Lecture Series began as an initiative of the Ngunnawal Centre at the university to give voice to the Indigenous Australian position on the many topics that shape Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities throughout this country. The Ngunnawal Lectures continue to do this by hosting prominent Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to talk about issues of significance. We're proud to be working with the Healing Foundation to co-host this panel of keynote speakers today, to learn about the work of international and national experts in Indigenous mental health, including social and emotional well-being, and discuss ways in which we as a community can, as the title of today's event says, affect our well-being. Lectures and events such as these are important ways in which the university can communicate and share knowledge with the wider community, and we hope help inform public opinion and shape government policy. The Ngunnawal Centre itself provides a foundation studies program and a complete range of support services for our students, in addition to offering a major and minor in Indigenous studies. The centre also has an elder in residence to assist in cultural matters and build collaborations between the community and the university. In the past 18 months, the number of Indigenous Australian students enrolling in degree programs at the university has risen by 20%. This has resulted from the fact that the Ngunnawal Centre works with local communities to promote the variety of studies that Indigenous students can access here and has developed foundation programs specific to their needs. We'll soon be announcing a major partnership with an Indigenous organisation to create new opportunities for Indigenous people to access higher education, not just at UC, but across Australia. In this and other ways, I hope we can deliver conscientiously on our Reconciliation Action Plan. The university's Indigenous alumni are successful in many professions and walks of life across Australia and internationally. A recent example is Glenn Brennan, who is Head of Indigenous Finance and Development at the National Australia Bank and who won a Distinguished Alumni Award of the university last year. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for participating and for coming to the University of Canberra, and I hope that you will enjoy and appreciate it as much as I'm sure I will. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Parker. I'd like to now invite Dr. Wendy Brady, who is, as you know, the Director of the Ngunnawal Centre here at the University of Canberra, to come up and say a couple of words.
Sometimes I think it's better to leave the applause till later once you know what I'm going to say. I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, and I also wish to acknowledge my own nation, the Wiradjuri nation, and I acknowledge all people's cultures and backgrounds here today, and I thank you for coming to this lecture. This lecture is named after the Ngunnawal Centre, and it means a lot to both the students and staff of the Ngunnawal Centre. This topic is one that we are desperately in need of more recognition. The speakers today come from a range of different positions in terms of health and well-being, and I think that as Director of the Centre, we know the realities of health and wellbeing issues amongst staff and students, communities, families. And I believe that through more exchange of knowledge, greater recognition of our needs, and much more government support for our needs, that we will be able to effect change. I don't know if I'll see it, but I hope that my generations to come will see it. I want to make sure that my grandsons and great-great-grandsons and granddaughters have a better life to live. I also want to acknowledge the role of the university in supporting us in the Ngunnawal Centre. The Reconciliation Action Plan has been at the forefront of our minds in what we do in the Ngunnawal Centre, and the support that we've received both from the Vice-Chancellor and from the faculties and business areas of the university have made a huge difference. And that, I think, is apparent from the increase in the number of students who are participating and progressing and reaching successful outcomes. I'd also like to acknowledge a member of the Faculty of Health, Kerry Doyle, an Indigenous woman who has contributed greatly to the programs in health and Indigenous health here at the university and elsewhere, and who's going to actually leave us for 9 months to go to Oxford to study. And I think that that deserves some recognition too. Congratulations, Kerry. I'd also like to say that it's absolutely amazing that we have gathered here today such an amazing group of people who are going to speak to you. Tom Calma, Fiona Stanley, Michael Chandler, Helen Milroy and Pat Dudgeon. These are the people who are advancing the whole issue of health and wellbeing for Indigenous Australians, and I have absolutely no doubt that we will enjoy it and learn a great deal. Thank you.
Yes, I agree. I think we're certainly in for a really interesting and good afternoon, and it's nice to finish a week with such a wonderful opportunity to stimulate our minds and to leave the week's work behind with such worthy work. I'd like to acknowledge the Healing Foundation also and ask the CEO of the Healing Foundation, Richard Weston, to come up. As you know, Richard's a Mirren man. He's been the CEO of the Healing Foundation for some time, and it's the Healing Foundation that is given us the opportunity of being able to meet Professor Chandler and hear his work. As you know, that they've been instrumental in organising the Professor's visit here to Australia and proudly co-host this afternoon event with the University of Canberra. So I'll just invite you to say a few words for us, Richard. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. Just acknowledge the Ngunnawal people as the traditional owners of the country that we're on today, and ancestors past and present. The Healing Foundation has been very pleased to support the visit and be a partner in the visit of Professor Chandler from Canada here in Australia over the last couple of weeks, and we've been working with a number of partners, and today we're working with Stephen and the University of Canberra to bring you this event, which we're very pleased to do. And I just want to thank Wendy for those fantastic words and congratulate Kerry, who I do know, and it's a fantastic achievement, Kerry. And Lisa Jackson Pulver, who it's great to have here, and I call her Lisa, I don't call her Professor because I knew her before she was a professor, so I just know her as Lisa. And she has done she has made a wonderful contribution to Aboriginal health, wellbeing, and continues to do so. She's a tireless worker in that field. And I want to acknowledge the speakers that we've got today. We've got Pat, Helen, Michael, who I've mentioned, Fiona Stanley. Fiona Stanley comes, you would all know Fiona Stanley's name, and I've heard her described in, I've never met you personally until today, but Fiona did have a role in helping getting the Healing Foundation up off the ground as a group that was working on a response for Indigenous affairs at the 2020 summit, which some of us might remember, but we're very pleased that she was there that day pushing for the Healing Foundation. And Tom Calma, who's made a wonderful contribution in the last few years to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs landscape, and is a key player in trying to get our people to cut down on their smoking, which is important to improved health outcomes. Just a little bit about the Healing Foundation. There's a bit of a blurb up there, but we've been in existence for nearly 3 years. We're primarily a funding body, so we fund projects directly into communities. To date, we've funded 72 projects. We're currently working on a rollout of a stolen generations specific program, and we expect to fund around 22 stolen generations programs targeted towards those members of the stolen generations who are over 50. So that's going to be a very important project for us going forward. Some of the achievements that we've have come from our projects, the first raft of 20 projects that we've funded, up until the end of last year, those projects have employed 164 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across 19 projects that are still current. 100% of those projects have been designed, developed and delivered by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, which means that the programs are appropriate for that community and come from an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander worldview. And as you'll see in the talks this afternoon, how important those aspects of service development and delivery are. Over 3,600 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have participated in the healing activities delivered by these projects, and there have been over 560 cultural activities provided to help people reconnect to culture, maintain culture, build pride in cultural identity, and the success of this is further demonstrated by nearly 100%, 96% of participants self-reporting improves social, spiritual and emotional wellbeing and connection. Now those are quite impressive figures, but it's early days yet for those projects, and we know very well that we need to put in that there will be robust evaluations of those projects, but we think we're on the right track. And I think what's been very pleasing for me personally, listening to Michael Chandler this week, is that the things that he talks about are elements that we're building into the projects that we fund going forward. Research is certainly a big part of our agenda. Michael will talk about his research. And at the Healing Foundation, we're very keen to develop an evidence base, an Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander evidence base that supports robust approaches to healing in our communities. Healing is a hot topic of conversation in all the communities that I go to. Everybody brings it up. And I'm sure there's many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the audience that would talk to you about healing and why it's needed for our communities. But without any further ado, I'll pass back to Lisa, and you will enjoy this afternoon's event because these people are fantastic speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. I'd like to introduce and give you a little bit of an overview of each of the speakers that we've got here today, and then we'll hear from them, and then we'll have an opportunity for some questions and answers at the end of this. So for any of you who have any really good burning questions, get a notepad and a paper and write them down so you don't forget them, because what'll happen is the next speaker will come along and they'll be absolutely fabulous as well, and you'll have more. So just know that we will have an opportunity to have some questions and answers at the end. So, today's Ngunnawal lecture, affecting our wellbeing. It is a hot topic. Everyone's talking about it, everyone wants to know about it, and everyone recognises, if they've got any sense that is, that the worldviews that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people bring to the area of health and wellbeing is profound, important, and certainly for quite a long time not being heard or listened to or recognised. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Tom Calma. He's an elder of the Canberra people and a member of the Iwitja tribal group, and has been involved in Indigenous affairs at a local, community, state, national and international level for more than 40 years. He's currently on a number of boards and committees here in Australia, and he focuses on rural and remote Australia, health, education and economic development. So he has a rather broad portfolio, so he's certainly the right person to open up today. Dr. Calma is Deputy Vice-Chancellor here at the University of Canberra. Our second speaker is Professor Helen Milroy, who's a descendant of the Palku people of the Pilbara region of Western Australia. She's the Winthrop Professor and Director of the Centre of Aboriginal Medical and Dental Health at the University of Western Australia, and a consultant child and adolescent psychiatrist with the Specialist Aboriginal Mental Health Service in the Department of Health in Western Australia. She's also the first Aboriginal doctor that this country has ever graduated. She'll be followed by Professor Fiona Stanley, who's trained in epidemiology and public health and was Australian of the Year in 2003. She's a patron of the Telethon Institute for Child Health Research, a distinguished research professor at the School of Paediatrics and Child Health at the University of Western Australia. She's Vice-Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Melbourne and Director of the 2013 Festival of Ideas. Then we'll be followed up with Emeritus Professor Michael Chandler, who is one of the most internationally eminent academics in the field of Indigenous social and emotional wellbeing and suicide prevention. Currently a distinguished scholar in residence at the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies, he was until 2004 Professor of Psychology at the University of British Columbia in Canada. We will also have on our panel for the question time Professor Pat Dudgeon, who is a Bardi woman in the Western Australia. She was the first Aboriginal psychologist to graduate in Australia. She's made an outstanding contribution to Indigenous psychology, leadership and higher education, and is a member of many prestigious committees. She's currently a research fellow at the School of Indigenous Studies at the University of Western Australia. Professor Dudgeon is Commissioner with the National Mental Health Commission and is Chair of the Commonwealth Government's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Mental Health Advisory Group. So, as I said before, we're in for a great afternoon with lots and lots of brain food. Please, first, can we welcome Dr. Tom Calma.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you all. I'll begin also by acknowledging the Ngunnawal peoples on whose land we're meeting, and pay respects particularly to their youth and all youth, because they're our future leaders, and they will be the ones who carry forward our stories, our cultures, our traditions, and I believe we all need to think about that and to show the due respect that youth and young people need in our society, because it's very different, and it will be very different to the way society is today. And you'll pick up in a lot of what we talk about is the need to develop resilience, and that's also about looking at youth into the future. Just a quick slide. I'll flick that one because that was what we were starting off with in what we're going to talk about. But Pat's decided to let us share a little bit longer, and she'll just respond to questions. My presentation is really to do an overview about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs and sort of set the scene for where we're going. And particularly when we look at population, currently just over 500,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people out of 22 million in Australia, so it's roughly 3%, just under. But what's significant is that it's a very young population and the fastest growing population group in Australia. And it's not a homogenous group. We comprise of many nations within the nation, and so it's a very important consideration in any policy development, but also in some of the work that we do. We also know in the last census that the numbers have grown again in the 2011 census, and so with that expectation, with that understanding and the expectation that it's going to continually to grow, we need to also think about what policy implications that has into the future, and also about how do we work within those population groups now. And when you compare it to the mainstream population, it becomes really important to not try and look at one size fits all solution, but many different approaches. We look at the life expectancy, and a real clear indicator again in yellow, Aboriginal Trust Islander population, very young but tapers off very quickly, so we don't have very many Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people living to a ripe old age as compared to the non-Indigenous population, which is very important. So it doesn't matter what discipline you're in, whether you're in health discipline here or in any of the other disciplines, you need to think about these issues and how we work within the various population groups that exist within Australia. If we're looking from a health perspective, we look at when people die. We see the very high incidence of infant mortality, the red, the bottom one. Our children not reaching 1 year of age, passing too quickly, then we die as Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people right throughout the life cycle, whereas the non-Indigenous population has a very low death rate early in life, but it's when you get into late in life. And so again, that has an implication for all of us in the way that we look at what we do. And working with young people versus working with older people are very different. And we need to take that into consideration and open our minds during our learning process and in our teaching. What's also important when we look at life expectancy at birth and what the expectations are, and you see that it differs state by state, and this is not all states, but it's just there for illustration, that somebody living in the Northern Territory has a far lesser life expectancy than somebody living in New South Wales. And so again, it's not that one size fits all approach. We need to look at decentralising and getting down to responses that happen within a geographic area, be it a community, be it in a region. We look at some of the major contributors to death of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, and smoking is the biggest one. Contributes to about 20%, just under, of deaths. But the big ones, obesity and lack of activity, lack of access to good food and so forth, are all there. But now when we look at mortality, and when we look at issues of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander affairs, if you just relied on the mainstream media, you'd think that we're all alcoholics and that's our biggest problem. Well, it's not our biggest problem. There's a whole range of other things that we have to look at. But the good news is that all of them are preventable, and if we can have the right sort of intervention, we can change behaviours, we can change attitudes, we can provide greater access to medications or services, and that will make a difference in life expectancy. The other big impact is about income, and we know the relationship between health and income. But when 50% of the population is in the lowest quintile of income, that's a big problem, and for us, and that's where a lot of our people are. So one of the big challenges is how do we move from a very impoverished group into ones who can improve that status. And why it becomes important when you start to look at things like income and the relationships with other dependencies, be it tobacco, alcohol and so forth. Those in the lower socioeconomic groups tend to have a greater incidence of using abusive substances that could very much be related to a mental health issue or a past trauma, an increasing trauma. The only difference is that as you improve in your income level, your consumption of alcohol also, or access to alcohol, improves. So that one just sort of breaks away from that trend a little. We look at again some of the relationships between income and also some of the major chronic diseases. They're up there. You can have a look at these later, but you can see the big differences. Some are more stark than others when you compare Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander health outcomes to non-Indigenous, particularly looking at it from the level of economic empowerment. The big question, why is it that in Australia the life expectancy is 10 to 17 years, the difference between the mainstream population and the Indigenous population, whereas in the other countries, Canada, New Zealand, USA, it's not so stark. It's very different. And so, you know, the question's got to be, why is it in a country like Australia that, you know, that is fairly rich, very rich if you compare it to international countries and the international situation, why can't we work on working through and dealing with the health outcomes of 3% of the population? That's the big challenge, and it's something that we need to look at. And as I said, we look at physical health, we look at you know, housing, we look at the economic situation, and in our case, what we'll talk a lot more about is mental health and social and emotional wellbeing. Bit of self-promotion, report I did in 2005. No, not self-promotion, but it's, well, it is really. But yeah, it's a report I did in 2005 looking at that disparity in health outcomes, and really said that we needed to do something within a generation, and that's a very strategic and planned approach, and that led into the Close the Gap campaign. But it also introduced into Australia the notion of social determinants in a meaningful way. And they are, what are those other things, some that I've touched on, that impact on somebody's health. And this is taken out of a 2010 report by government, which they're starting to talk the language. And internationally, they've started to talk the language since about 2006, 2007. And it's something that we all need to be thinking about in the work that we do, the studies that we're doing, and the teaching that we're doing, and making sure that we do look at the interrelationships, because that's what's critically important in any address to any issues of disadvantage that might be out there. Close the Gap campaign I mentioned. If you don't know about it, you should. We're in an environment where the government, the federal government, and the opposition have signed up to a statement of intent to make a difference within 2030 and by 2030, and it's something that that is working, I think. The process is starting, but it's about long-term planning, it's about partnership, it's about engagement with Aboriginal Trust and Islander people, and empowering us to take control and direct some of the policy that affects us. These same principles apply in the general population, but when it comes to Aboriginal Trust and Islander population, there is a bit of a feeling from government that they need to do something because they know better. We, as part of that environmental shift, we also see this statement that came out of the Prime Minister today, Kevin Rudd, which does talk about doing things differently, making sure that we don't have the one-size-fits-all, making sure that we do look at you know, funding on needs, we do look at partnership, we do look at empowerment and so forth. And that was backed up in 2010 by a Department of Finance report, which is a fairly critical one to look at, because that also says that government policies and programs in the past 40 years have failed, pretty much because of the top-down imposition and not really working with the communities and empowering the communities, and it goes on. You can read all this sort of stuff a bit later. When I look at suicide, I chair the Aboriginal Trust and Islander Suicide Prevention Advisory Group. We've come up with a set of principles on how governments should apply their funding to suicide prevention, and again reinforces the need for partnership, for community empowerment, for engagement, for making sure that the programs have some longevity, that they're not just one-off, you know, political cycle levels of funding, because that happens too often. And you know, a program is, the funding stops virtually at the time it just gets started. So we're hoping to have a fairly significant influence. We have already got that with the money that's directed towards suicide prevention, but these sort of principles should be applying across the board. This we like because when we first started looking at suicide prevention, we wanted to find out who else is in the space, and it's just horrific when you look at all these various government agencies. This doesn't even pick up on all the NGOs that are out there, but the government agencies and commissions that are out there. The sad thing is that they don't all talk to each other, and they all do their own thing, and that is part of what the Department of Finance said. They need to get their act together and make sure that they start to synergise funding a bit more, make sure that we work together a lot more to be able to do it. And the committees that I'm on, and I guess it's part of the fortunate position we're on, is that people like Pat and myself and Helen are on a number of committees that are in common membership. So we do informally talk, but we don't get the opportunity to formally discuss these things. So that was really the big roundup. But I'll leave you with this slide for you to contemplate, because I think it's important and it's incumbent on all of us to understand the impacts of discrimination and racism in what we do, and make sure that we all consider a pledge like this, to take your own personal pledge to make sure that you don't promote or offend through discrimination or racism. And of course the top one in red is what's really what we're all on about, and that is how do we create hope, how do we build resistance and resilience in our people. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm very impressed that you've all turned out on a kind of cold and wet Friday afternoon. I know where I'd rather be. So well done, and thank you for coming to listen to us. I'm going to talk a little bit about wellbeing, and apologies to a couple of people who may have been at the earlier presentation this morning, because it is the same presentation. Just pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land, the Ngunnawal people, and also to remind us that we have this lovely new building here, but beneath us is thousands and thousands of years of Indigenous history. Okay, so my task was really to sort of talk a little bit about wellbeing. I'm not actually going to give you any data, but just talk more generally about wellbeing from an Indigenous perspective. And of course, you can't talk about wellbeing without talking about country and connection to country. And this is a photo of my grandmother's country, and the reason I like this particular photo is because it's not only important for Aboriginal people to be reflected within their own landscape, but the country has its own reflection itself, and it's important for us to understand what that really means. And then again, of course, we can't talk about wellbeing without talking about family and community and history. And as my grandmother holds my mother, she holds me, and then I hold my children. And so that generational perspective is so important for everybody in life and health and wellbeing, but particularly important for our Indigenous community members, given that there's been so much disruption to that continuity of our family and our histories. And it's so important to reclaim some of that. And then again, of course, culture, and we'll go through some of these things in a little bit more detail, to recognise the diversity of our cultural groups all around Australia, but also just to realise that Australia, when you look at it from an Indigenous perspective, doesn't look like the Australia we normally see in terms of the mapping, and to understand that sort of level of diversity that enriches our wellbeing as well. And as was already spoken about earlier, particularly from the Healing Foundation, was this notion of healing. And again, because it's such a short presentation, I won't go into all the details of these stories and paintings and meanings, but just to make the point that healing is a very important issue to consider from a very broad-based perspective. And it's not just about sort of clinical services, it's about healing from a much broader perspective. And at the earlier session this morning, someone talked about the apology and the impact that had. And I think that was a very important step in regard to healing, because it was an acknowledgement of our past and an acknowledgement of some of the suffering that our people have been through. Without that validation, I think it is hard to move forward. Now we've had that, it has created, I think, a new opportunity for us to look at healing in a very different way. But clearly healing is part of the process in wellbeing. So what I'm going to talk about today mostly is wellbeing in terms of ways of doing, ways of knowing, ways of doing and ways of being from an Indigenous perspective as I've come to understand it. And that particular painting is a painting that reflects wellbeing as being a collective and the importance of standing strong together. And when we do stand strong together, we can lay back and float on the breeze. So the first thing is about ways of knowing, and I think the point I want to make here is that, we have the oldest Indigenous knowledge base in the world. We are the oldest continuous living culture, and there's a very good reason why I'm able to stand here before you today, and that was because of the strength of my ancestry and the strength of my history, and the fact that we must have been doing some pretty good stuff if we've actually survived what we've survived and we can stand strong today. So there must be some good things that we can learn from our own knowledge base that isn't otherwise recognised. And the difficulty we have with evidence bases is that we have a hierarchy of evidence base, and we privilege some knowledge bases over others, when in actual fact it should be a flattened hierarchy. So as I said, we're the oldest knowledge living base in the world. We have a lot of understanding around resilience and endurance and survival, and We've learnt a lot from observation over many, many generations. We have an extensive knowledge of pharmacopoeia within our own country, in our own landscape, and ways of using natural medicines and natural processes. And that idea of being located within landscape and being part of that balance with nature as a way of understanding life and well-being as well. And if we think about it, if we can combine both, a Western knowledge base with our Indigenous knowledge base, then we have the most complete knowledge base in the entire world. So that puts Australia right up as number one, if we can manage to do that. And I think that's a pretty good place to think of where we could head to. So the next part is ways of doing. So this painting is really is called the Dance of Life. It's a model of health and well-being. The idea being that when all the dimensions are around you are in balance, and you're in balance with the universe, you can dance through life. The dimensions being that you stand on your family and community and your spirituality. You reflect everything back through culture. As you hold your head up high, as you grow and develop and reach forward to all of those experiences waiting in life and development. And so it's important to understand anything that we do from that very broad-based, multi-dimensional perspective. So our models of care should really be built up from that more multi-dimensional view. If you think about the way our traditional healers used to work, they didn't have inclusion and exclusion criteria like our services today have. They were completely inclusive, and I think that that's a real lesson there. They also didn't have cut-off criteria that you could have 6 sessions of CBT and then you're done. They treated you until you were better. So I think that some of our old models of care we could actually learn a lot from. And it's really interesting because the move at the moment in mental health is about having, patient-centred, family-centred, community-centred, holistic models. That's what we've been talking about for years. So I think that in some respects, Indigenous communities are actually leading the way in developing these more person-friendly models of care. They need to be collaborative, multidimensional, obviously culturally derived so that we can see ourselves within the models of care in which we access, adaptive, generational, and of course, relationship-based. I think it's really interesting when you expect, particularly, say, children to come into services. Children don't attach to a service. They attach to a person. And I would defy any person who has to seek help anywhere that they're going to attach to the service, that you're going to attach to the people that see you, that you learn to trust, that you respect and that you feel safe with. And I think it's about time we developed our models of care to reflect the need for those relationship-based services. And then, of course, there's ways of being. So wellbeing is also about the way we see ourselves in the world, the way we're comfortable with our own sense of identity, our own way of understanding life and society and our relationship even with the nation and the rest of the world. So ways of being is about a state of being. It's about a sense of balance and harmony, all of those interconnections that we have in life. One of the important things about wellbeing, or about that broader sense of attachment and connection from Indigenous culture, was this notion of a broader-based attachment system. So not only was there no concept of being an orphan in Indigenous society, you couldn't actually be an orphan, there was always someone within kinship who had an obligation to care for you or be your mother. You also were attached to things outside of humanity, so you were attached to land and totem and plants and animals. So some of our stolen gen people, when they were in institutions and things like that, they still weren't actually alone. They still actually had attachment to other things outside of their family. And because of their spirituality as well, they were also still attached to sight, despite the separation physically. So that gave a much broader sense of resilience, I think, which is why some of our people have actually survived so well. And of course, it's also about an understanding of the meaning and your purpose in your own life. And of course, all of these things are very much interrelated. By the way, I'm going to race through these slides because I want to tell you a story at the end, which I'm going to get to in a minute. So one of the other issues about ways of being and ways of doing and all of these things, if we put them all together, is to try and develop a more Indigenous perspective on what is considered best practice. Now, I know we talk a lot about evidence, but if we only take a sort of more clinical view, then we're missing out on a huge amount of knowledge that is useful. So both cultural and clinical perspectives have cumulative gains that clearly outweigh benefits from a single track. And a combined approach that explores the biological and psychological functioning of individuals and at the same time locates individuals in an ecological context is really what is going to be a holistic model that actually improves our wellbeing and our health and life outcomes in general. And clearly, if we're going to actually look at how we develop the evidence base around that, then we also have to understand how we look at outcomes. So if we're going to develop wise practice into the future and have a look at issues around social and emotional wellbeing or mental health, then we need to look at both the old and the new knowledge systems. We have to combine both the clinical and the cultural. It needs to be outcome focused on where we want to go to rather than throughput, which is what a lot of our services actually report on. And we've got to have an appropriate evaluation system. You can't do randomised clinical controlled trials on cultural issues. And nor would you want to do some sort of wellbeing measure on taking a medication. So we both have to have our evaluations appropriate to the actual part of the service provision that we're actually doing. We also need to have more understanding and meaning about what we are doing in services. And I think that one of the things that struck me when I was recently abroad on a study tour was this notion of both a personal and a professional commitment. It's all very well to be professional in your role in services, but when you're dealing with people and you're dealing with humanity and you're dealing with suffering and pain, you also have to have a personal commitment. And it is our responsibility as clinicians, both personally and professionally, to assist people in their recovery, as opposed to saying, I can't help you, go somewhere else. I think that personal commitment I see sometimes is lacking. So the process in developing these sort of combined models is that we need to have support for both sides. We need to both support the Indigenous people as well as the non-Indigenous people who are working within our services, because they both have a really hard path to follow, particularly when you're working around serious issues of mental health or trauma recovery or whatever it is you may be doing. There's got to be really good communication, and we've got to start reducing these miscommunications or misunderstandings that we see all the time. There's got to be the ability to develop trust, and trust takes time. People don't trust a service because it's a service. They trust people in the service because the people are trustworthy. And those sorts of things I don't think are given enough emphasis. We've also got to have empathy and connection. You can't just be professional. You really have to have an emotional involvement. Education, upskilling, all of those other sorts of things, cultural elements and safety are all part of the mix. And what we hope to achieve by having this combined system is a much better service responsiveness that actually meets the needs of our mob. A greater ability to accept treatments on both sides of the coin, both cultural models, both clinical models, that actually work together to enhance someone's wellbeing. I mean, the fact that we can use both the oldest wisdom in the world and the newest technology is a wonderful opportunity for recovery. We should be doing that more. Everyone could benefit from that. Sometimes when you combine these things together, you actually get relief on both sides. Everyone feels so much better that they've actually provided what is a really good model of care. And what we want to try and move services from is from a sort of a position of psychological dissonance to one of a cultural resonance for everyone's wellbeing. So I'm going to finish now with a story, just to sort of leave you with a couple of questions about our responsibility, whether you're academics, whether you're clinicians, whether you're policymakers. This is called The Little Green Frog. The little green frog sat at the edge of the waterhole watching the ripples in the water. It was so beautiful and clear, you could almost see the coloured stones lying on the bottom, except the movement of the water put them out of focus. The little green frog longed to swim to the bottom, but he knew it was too deep. It was very deceiving because the water was so pure. He would love to have collected some of the coloured stones. Suddenly, a large barramundi swam into the waterhole and rested on the colourful stones. "Are you looking at my pretty stones, Frog?" said Barramundi. "Yes," Frog replied, "but I'm too small to swim to the bottom of your waterhole, but I would love to have one." Barramundi swam to the surface with a bright red stone in his mouth. "Here is a present for you, Frog," he said, giving Frog the red stone. "Oh, thank you, Barramundi, but I haven't got a present to give you." "You can give me one of those blue flowers that grow on the rocks," Barramundi said. Frog picked up a blue flower and gave it to Barramundi. "The pretty stones you see I have been collecting since I was very young," Barramundi said. "They are all memories. The red stone is full of happy memories." "Oh, thank you. I will treasure it always," said Frog. Each day Frog would visit the waterhole. Each day Barramundi would give Frog a pretty stone, who in turn gave Barramundi a lovely flower. The little green frog was enjoying the beautiful coloured stones so much. They made him feel very happy, so he didn't visit the waterhole for a while. "I will go and visit my friend today," he thought, and set off for the waterhole, where his friend Barramundi lived. Barramundi was floating on the top of the water, with a black stone in his mouth, and surrounded by half-dead and rotting flowers. You can't give away your past memories. You need them to see the future. So what can we take from this story? I guess there's layers of meanings in Indigenous stories, which is what I love about them. But we often take stories from our communities and our patients and give nothing in return. We consult over and over again, we do research over and over again, and yet ignore our recommendations and our policies and our programs and fail to implement them fully. Do we get caught up with what we have taken and fail to return to those who have given their gifts so freely? How many beautiful stones do we hold in our hand today? And when we hold these beautiful stones that we have collected and we think about what they mean and the stories, I think it's our responsibility personally and professionally to give them back as hope. Thank you.
I'd also like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people and the ancestors past and present, and add my congratulations to the Oxford-bound Kerry Doyle, who's going off. And I presume it's a Perkins Scholarship, and they're so prestigious. So you're made, kid. You're just made. I am going to just, I guess, share a little bit of my experience over the years in terms of research and working in Aboriginal health and mental health, but really child-adolescent health, and the issues that I think are really important and impart them to you. I've been inspired. I just want to tell a story about Joan Winch, which is inspired by Helen's comments about research and how Aboriginal knowledge has been there for a long time, and research is a bit useless when you think about it. And Joan Winch, who's the most wonderful Aboriginal woman in Western Australia, a nurse who got the Sasakawa Prize from WHO for the top community health project in the world for setting up Aboriginal health training in Western Australia. And I was talking to her about the fact that we were doing breastfeeding research. I laugh about it now, breastfeeding research and the importance of mothers for child development. And she just looked at me in absolute amazement. She said, "Fiona, you're researching that? We've known that for 40,000 years. And I said, "Yes, Joan, but we've forgotten it." And think about that. Our society has forgotten the basic tenets, often, of what makes for a healthy and socially a society that's got social well-being. And you think of what's happening to our planet right now, and a little bit of Joan Winch's and Helen's wisdom might be not a bad thing. Let's think about what Aboriginal knowledge really means for the way that we live and interact and sustain our planet. So I'm also inspired by another Aboriginal scholar that I've just met called Sean Ewan, whom you may know down at Ian Anderson's Anemda in Melbourne, and he's the dean there in the Aboriginal Studies sector at Melbourne University. And he's just written a paper on Parahistius, who was a Greek scholar, who promulgated that we needed fearless speech. And it just resonated with me, because I've now retired as director of the Institute, and I don't have to be nice to anybody anymore, like the West Australian miners who don't give us any money. And so I've decided that I will take a leaf from Sean Ewan's book and fearless speech and the Parahistias approach. And fearless speech he's given in the context of medical education and of Aboriginal people and what we need to do. And fearless speech has got frankness, truth, danger. I could get into danger by giving fearless speech, and so could Aboriginal people, but they need to be fearless. Criticism, but we have a duty to do it. And I think those are very good things that are things to think about as we think about what we want to say about some of these issues. And he gives a couple of quotes in his paper, which relate to my next 2 points. The first point I wanted to make was that one of the things that we have to do together as a nation is to provide accessible, effective, non-racist care. I mean, it's such a unrocket science thing to say. If you've got anybody who needs the kind of care that Aboriginal people, or any people need, that's not a bad thing to do. But we're not doing it. And one of the reasons we're not doing it is because we are producing simplistic, siloed solutions to complex problems. That's one thing. And I think that we also need to do prevention more than care, although you can't say to a suicidal young Aboriginal kid, "Oh, look, hang on there, we're going to prevent you tomorrow." You've got to provide the care. And we know a lot of what's needed. We just have to apply it in a way that's going to be effective. And then the second point, which relates to the quotes I'm going to give you from Sean, are that we need Aboriginal control and real partnerships. And that really, really means about non-Aboriginal people in powerful positions, in the bureaucracy, in governments, and even in NGOs, relinquishing with power and support and and sustainable ways the power to Aboriginal people to run their own services and to influence the services that are provided. And that's the major reason we failed to deliver with this juggernaut of Aboriginal funding that's, as everyone says, been wasted. Not all of it's been wasted, but a huge amount of funding has gone down the gurgler because it hasn't been effective, because Aboriginal people haven't had control of it, because they live in a different kind of worldview and have a different perspective than the people who have developed the services either in Canberra or in other central cities and so on. And so the quotes from Sean are that the health needs of a population will be better met if the demographic profile of the doctor population, he's in relation to medical education, more closely reflected that of the populations that they serve. 2.5% of our medical student intake is now Aboriginal. Tom, that's the same as the percentage of the Aboriginal population in the community. Now, if they all graduated, we've got parity. How great is this? Helen, you've got to take a bit of a bow here. Aren't you running all the medical student mentoring and support in Western Australia? This is a phenomenal thing, and I think we've got to feel. I'm getting goosebumps as I think about what that means. 25 Aboriginal doctors. 5, but 25 Aboriginal doctors at least in Western Australia and 140 nationwide, and we've now got at least 140 medical students who are Aboriginal. So you can do it. It's not as if we can't do it. I think that's the most exciting thing. And the other thing that the fearless speaker, Sean Ewan, said, we don't want marginalised populations to produce marginalised academics and researchers. And that's absolutely true. And when you look around now and you say to bureaucrats and politicians, you know, you don't have to have second best. Aboriginal people are there, they're graduating, look at what University of Canberra's doing, look at what other people are doing. You can have Aboriginal people in positions of power who are as competent as anybody else. You haven't any excuse not to engage and to empower Aboriginal people. So I think this is all very exciting. And I think that the Aboriginal Control and Real Partnerships has epitomised what we've done in our Centre of Research Excellence, which Pat and I are part of in Perth, along with a whole lot of other people, using community participation action research methodology, which you guys know and live. But it's been a fantastic road for me to be on with this group of, most of them now Aboriginal postdocs, with Michael Wright doing his project on Aboriginal mental health, Cheryl Kicker-Tucker doing her project on identity and the importance of self-esteem in Aboriginal kids and young people, Rhonda Marriott doing a fabulous project which will connect with Helen's work in terms of an early intervention for Aboriginal mothers project, the Two Solid project, and Dawn Bessarab, who's doing amazing work in the Kimberley on alcohol and other things. And I think that this group has taught me to engage properly with Aboriginal families and communities in a way which is strengthening and not weakening those groups of people. And there are some wonderful examples of that. Dorothy Scott, for example, who was the first professor of child abuse in Australia, worked in the Wapiya lands, the Pitjantjatjara people, the Ngati people, and the kids there had a high rate of failure to thrive. They were taken off to Darwin, put on drips, and then sent back into the community, and of course they got failure to thrive again, and so on. Dorothy went to the elders, the women, and she said, what would you do? And they said, we're going to set up a program, a homemaker program, and we want you to help us to do it. So all the older women in the community brought in all the young mothers with their little babies, and they had a homemaker program. They cooked, they looked after the kids, they fed them. End of kids going off to Darwin for drips because the kids were being fed and looked after. The Fetal Alcohol Syndrome Manifesto, developed by June Oscar, Emily Carter and Olive Bindry up in the Fitzroy Valley, where they've stopped takeaway alcohol, but there's also an amazing strategy, is the best strategy for fetal alcohol syndrome I have ever seen. Fund it. Just go with that. That is the solution. There isn't any other thing you really need to do but to support that kind of Aboriginal-led solution that is going to actually solve the problem. The only thing we need to do is walk beside, fund it. I mean, the only reason we need to deal with government, is anyone here from government, is that we actually need your money. Otherwise, just give the ideas to the Aboriginal people and the partners who are working with them. Sorry about this, but, it's called fearless speech. And I think the next thing that we need to have in my little list is, which everyone's talked about, and Helen's epitomised so beautifully with her gorgeous paintings, is to preserve, embrace and use the power of Aboriginal culture. It's immensely powerful, immensely powerful. And that means that what we need to do is to encourage, support and fund those sorts of things. And that's why the Healing Foundation was such an important thing to get up, and I'm absolutely thrilled that it's doing so well. And it's wonderful to meet you, Richard. And so part of that, though, and part of the Aboriginal Healing Foundation in Canada was to educate the non-Aboriginal people of Australia. And I hope that this really takes off, because if we understand and appreciate Aboriginal culture and history and the impact that the stolen generation has had, it explains so much of the current situation. And it's this empathy that Helen's talked about. But if we put ourselves in those shoes, we would be there. Can't we understand that? And to have that history, but also there's this fantastic upside as well as the downside, as everyone, and Helen particularly epitomised. We can be part of this. When I go out to Aboriginal communities, I feel fantastic. I feel welcomed, and the sharing of the knowledge and the love and the harmony that's there. As I often say, if they're so dysfunctional, why do I feel so good when I visit them? So it's really about valuing that Indigenous knowledge and understanding the impact of the earlier history and the impact on that. And I think that the other bit I want to put in is to mention Dr. Julie Coffin, who is another of our CRE researchers, postdoc, working up in Geraldton. And that's about implementing effective anti-bullying strategies. And I think this is a huge issue in terms of pathways into suicide. And she has developed the most fantastic intervention based on a series of DVDs for bullying in schools. And one of the reasons why kids aren't going to school and we've got a gap in education is, one is they're sick, the other is that they're bullied and they're very frightened about going into school. So it's about making those schools and getting strategies for getting bullying. So I think that's a really fantastic one. Again, Aboriginal solution knows how to do it. That's apparently going all around Western Australia now, so that's fantastic, and probably nationally, someone was saying to me, Tom, I think. And so the last thing is about, and this really was for the bureaucrats this morning, but I think it's something that you need to champion with all of us, and that is, I am sick of the lack of accountability of mainstream bureaucracy and their push for the extreme accountability of Aboriginal organisations. And I just think this is such a mismatch. Now, if you think of what I mean by accountability of the mainstream bureaucracy, first of all, they've spent billions of dollars on ineffective interventions that haven't engaged with the community they want to serve. So that's one big accountability cross in the thing. The second thing is that they've ignored the causal pathways and got simplistic solutions to complex problems. And that's really immoral. Again, and haven't understand, they don't have empathy. I mean, lots of people, they're not all bad. I'm sure that many of them are well-meaning, but the data show that this is a failure. And then there's this incredible blaming of Aboriginal organisations for not being able to financially account for every last bloody dollar. And, up in the Warman community, Ethel McGregor spends most of her time, thank God she's got about 4 degrees, she's Shirley Purdy's sister, who's head of council, and spends most of her time accounting for these pathetic little grants that last 1 or 3 years, if you're lucky, to make it work for the community. She said, you need a bloody PhD in how to work the system, and she's absolutely right. And so I think that they're the main points that I wanted to make, but I think that last one is something that I feel is something that we really almost need to expose as an injustice. And I just want to end with another story. And this is where Rhonda Marriott's project is going to be, I think, maybe quite powerful, and that is the story of the Nunavut community, and it relates to the fact that when you give power to an Aboriginal community, it can have enormous effects. Now, the Nunavut community is in northern Ontario. They got their land, and as part of their land deal, they said to the Canadian government, we want to bring back birthing to the Aboriginal community. Now, birthing, well, here's a community that's got high suicide rates, high child abuse rates, drunkenness, unemployment and so on. Women had to go 600 kilometres south to Moose Factory to have their babies, like women in the Kimberley have to do. And so birthing came back as a conjoint Aboriginal and mainstream service activity, okay? And I was amazed at the results. The caesarean section rates went from something like 35% to 3%. There was no preventable neonatal mortality. So the deaths that occurred were in birth defects and extreme prematurity. Because there was such a focus on prevention, the women's rates of complicated deliveries fell. But what was dramatic was the impact on the social and emotional outcomes of the community. So suicide rates fell, and men stopped abusing their wives, and child abuse fell, and those things. So, you know, that is a fantastic story of where you can get both partnerships, but Aboriginal control making an incredible difference to suicide rates in Indigenous populations. Thank you.
That's just the beginning of my list of asking for pardons. I'm a Canadian, and it's stereotypic of Canadians that they're always apologizing for something, right? So here are 3 kind of quick apologies that I want to spend just a moment on. And how many moments do I have? Like 20, is that right? Or so, okay. I'll maybe milk the or so a bit, if you don't mind. But I mean, the first thing to say is, of course, I'm from a very long way from home. And, you know, I could try to tell you about homesickness or still lingering jet lag. But the point of saying that is that, as you'll see in a moment as I get into my talk, that much of what I have to say here is about the diversity of Aboriginal communities in Canada, which is my home. And so I'll try to make a serious point of the fact that you can't go 20 miles in my province of British Columbia without bumping into another language, another set of spiritual beliefs, people with very different contexts with colonial suppression, and on and on. And so given that experience, and the leverage that I hope to get out of it, it would be a mistake for me to imagine that I could just jump on a plane and come 18,000 miles to Australia and be able to simply tell you things about Canada that would necessarily translate. Although if I didn't believe that there was something that translated, then there would hardly be any point in my coming. Certainly, I believe that it's true that Indigenous people around the world suffer a common plight. That is, they've all been pillaged and had their culture turned into a laughingstock and criminalized and assimilated largely out of existence. At least that's been the case in Canada. I've been struck by some of the communities I've been privileged to meet with here in Australia. I had brief days in Broome and Fitzroy Crossing, where culture was very strong and some very strong community members, very strong women have accomplished and are remarkable, a lot of achievements. So anyway, my point is simply I'm hopeful that my visit here is some way a catalyst to a two-way discussion, and I hope to take back to Canada with me things that I'm learning here on a daily basis. The second kind of apology is that I'm one of those sort of heady, bookish academics who is talks numbers and puts up pie charts and things like that. And I will do that, and I think there's merit or a point in doing that. But the work is about suicide, and two codicils about that. One is that it's just about suicide almost accidentally. I mean, suicide is the tip of an iceberg, and there are many things that happen to people and communities when life no longer seems worth living. They drink excessively, their diet is poor, they are injured in accidents, they get HIV infection and hypertension, and on and on and on. So some of my work, the work that I will not be able to talk about today, begins to touch on the rest of the iceberg, of which suicide is the tip. I want to remind you of the fact that suicide is not somehow unique and freestanding, but also I want to mark the fact that suicide itself is as well as being a kind of a statistical showpiece for the purposes of researchers such as myself, it's a wound to families and communities, and in a sea of numbers, one could easily forget that. Suicide has touched my own life, and I'm sure the lives of many people in the audience. So I will talk about it in my usual kind of bookish manner, but I won't forget, and I know you won't forget, that these are heartfelt matters causing great pain to people. And finally, I guess the thing I want to say, before I kind of get into the meat of this, is that there are kind of various ways of looking at things like suicide in Indigenous communities or not. Some of them, perhaps the easiest way, is to just go to something like the Census Bureau, pile up the largest stack of statistics you could get your hands on, and troll aimlessly through it in the hopes of snagging something. And I had early experiences in my career as a student and young professor that persuaded me that that's a kind of a stupid way to run your life, doing that kind of research. And so I vowed never to do it again. And my work is, I hope, always driven by ideas, perhaps I could say theories, but at least a sense of commitment to something that one can understand conceptually and that has human meaning. I keep reducing the length of this talk as I move across Canada. One of the things that have gotten left out is my list of thank yous to people. It's, if I read through it, it would take up all of my 20 or 25 minutes. But I do want to particularly thank the Healing Foundation, who've run interference for me, helped me, taught me things, the Telethon Institute, and I can't even name all of the things that make up Pat's Mob, but I appreciate all of that very, very much. But if I try to reduce my talk down to a nutshell, it's this. Cultural wounds need cultural medicine. And everything else I say, I think, is just a riff upon that. But I'll riff on it for the next 15 minutes that I have. So I mean to try to divide my time here into 3 talking points. The first one is labeled oneself to a customer rule, which I'll try to unpack that odd statement. And then go on to talk about the central issue, I think, that I'm meant to talk about, which is sort of the epidemiology of, in this case, suicide in Aboriginal communities in Canada. And then I'll presume to end by offering what I think are some potential action and policy implications, at least as those I believe to be true in Canada and perhaps here in Australia. So let me say something about this notion of oneself to a customer rule. Some of my work, I'm trained as a developmental psychologist and I've spent really a lifetime worrying about issues of identity development in young people. And there is, I think, a consensus, maybe something coming close to a cultural universal, which suggests that in order to be a person or a self, you have to minimally own your past and have a commitment to your own future. So individuals, children are moving through time, life is a whirligig, and we're constantly changing. We're that sort of being who can't put their foot in the same stream twice. And yet, it's somehow constitutive of what it means to be a person to have a sense of commitment and ownership of your past. If you didn't, you'd be an amnesic. A culture without a connection to the past would have no moral authority. You couldn't make contracts. You couldn't borrow money. You couldn't get married. We're just we're historic beings, and we must own our past. And similarly, we must somehow commit ourselves to our future. I've spent as a student and beyond a lifetime of sitting on my hands in front of professors' offices and things like that, or burning midnight oil, all on the prospect that the person who would be the beneficiary of those just desserts would be me, okay? And even though I'm a kind of a depressive character, I haven't tried to kill myself because I can't tolerate the picture of wonderful me splattered on the pavement, right? So my point is about individuals, it's constitutive that you must own your past and your future. The point that I want to make here that I think relevant to the topic is that all of that is exactly true about whole cultures. That if you had a crowd of people that didn't share and own a common past, it would remain a crowd. If you had a crowd of people that didn't have a commitment to a common future, again, it would not be a culture, but a mere kind of milling collection of people. So cultures like people must be connected to their traditional past and have a sense of commitment to their future. But the sad story that we're all certainly familiar with is that colonization, wherever it's occurred, has been to erase the cultural past of Indigenous people and to rob them of any sense of control of their own future. So every colonizing group that I know enters, declares Indigenous knowledge of the sort that Helen talked about, null and void, and having reached the conclusion that these are people who are Stone Age and childlike, they assume some, quote, parental authority over their lives and tell them what to do. And both of those things, I think, are deeply corrosive. I call the ability of a community to somehow gain control of, or ownership of its past and control of its future, cultural continuity. You could call it what you like, but I need to talk about cultural continuity and try to give you some sense of how we've undertaken to measure it. So that's really the balance of my talk. Let me just say, I hope it's clear from what I've already said, that suicide is a kind of coal miner's canary. It isn't just interesting because it's a personal tragedy, but because it's a signal for the fact that a poisonous environment has developed that is lethal to whole communities. Let me talk then very quickly about some kinds of things that you would learn about suicide in Canada by reading the newspaper. One of these is that 3% of the population in Canada is Aboriginal, just about the same as it is here. That 9% of the suicides are Indigenous people. That of the Indigenous youth, or of youth in general who have committed suicide, 1 in 4 is an Indigenous or Aboriginal youth. And that of all the Indigenous suicides, more than half are those of young people. And that's just to paint the heartbreaking picture that youth suicide is dramatic, and it's essentially part of every Canadian citizen's presumptive knowledge about the way things go. The trouble with that knowledge is that it's false. It's not false in the sense that the actuarial keepers of the bits and pieces of information somehow got their sums wrong. It's wrong because they aggregate this information at a level in which they're adding apples and oranges, okay? Or apples and oranges would be great if we could get that close. So I want to make the point to you that Canada, and I'll focus most of my attention on Western Canada, or my own province, British Columbia. There it is, hanging off the edge of Western Canada. Here's the footprint of Western Europe. And the point is, British Columbia is about the size of Western Australia. It's a great big place, and one wouldn't dare make loose generalizations about the social similarities, cultural similarities of the whole of Western Europe. But people feel perfectly entitled to do that about the Indigenous people of Canada. I mean, some live on the seashore and kill whales, others are in the mountains, others are on the prairies, some are in the frozen north, others are in the not-so-frozen south. There are 14 mutually uninterpretable languages spoken, different cultural and spiritual beliefs, different contexts with colonizers, and it's just ignorance to batch process them all or imagine they can all be painted with the same broad brush. I call numbers like the number having to do with what's the suicidal rate of Aboriginal people in Canada actuarial fictions, because they effectively describe no one by describing data aggregated at such a high level that it becomes meaningless. So if you buy into what I've just said, then you want to disaggregate. You want to somehow get closer to the ground. Here's a way of doing this, which I think in the end is almost as empty of meaning as talking about the suicide rates for a whole province or country. This is suicide by census district. And what you see in that slide is that the blue, which are non-Indigenous people, it sort of doesn't matter what census district you live in, but the sawtooth pattern in red shows you that there are radically different suicide rates in different parts of this geography. But you could never figure out what that meant because census districts are simply some arbitrary lines some geek drew on a map somewhere, right? This is equally meaningless. This is by health region. So again, it doesn't matter what health region you're in, suicide rates are about the same. But again, the same radical sawtooth pattern for Indigenous people. And again, we don't know what that means because health regions are just inventions of some bureaucracy. Right? This, I hope, makes the next slide makes more sense. And it is, I think, perhaps part of the reason that there may be something that emerges from my research that's worth bringing to you. We were able to, there we go, look at suicide rates in British Columbia, a community or band at a time. It turns out that's really devilishly hard to do. There are 203 bands in British Columbia, and to find out what the suicide rate is over time in each of those communities is a bit of a climbing a glass mountain, I suppose. But anyway, in the end, we've been successful in getting that data, and we've collected it in 4 waves. We're now in the 4th wave of data collection. What you see there is, again, the same radical sawtooth picture with some groups having heart-stoppingly high levels of youth suicide. But I also draw your attention to the fact that many of these, for many of these bands, the rate touches the baseline, which means they have no suicides. Here's a better way of looking at that. What this slide means to show you is over on my right, the kind of red J-shaped thing that shows you that there are some communities with relatively few suicides and others with extremely high rates. But I think even more important, and against all stereotypic assumptions about Indigenous people, half of the communities, more than 100, have never had a youth suicide. Okay? So what I think that does all by itself is remove the race card from the deck. We know that there's variability in suicide, but it's not indigeneity that's causing this because half the communities, Indigenous communities, have no suicide. So we're now obligated to begin to kind of look elsewhere and try to understand what kind of factors are at work in determining this. I'll quickly say that for the statisticians among you, you might get really worried that these alarmingly high peaks are the artifacts of small sample sizes, and they are. You can get around that a little bit by looking at tribal councils. These are aggregates of usually 15 or so individual bands. And so we bump up the size of the sample in these cases, but the picture is the same. That's the picture, the same picture that I just showed you, again, strung out from none to some. And again, even at this level of aggregation, 1 in 5 of these tribal councils has never had a suicide in the more or less 35 years of recorded history that we've been tracking. Now, as soon as I show you that, and I've got to look at my watch and realize that I'm just about out of time, is what inquiring minds want to know as soon as you see that is what's true about those communities, all those communities that don't have any suicides, and what distinguishes them from the communities in which suicide rates are heartbreakingly high. So that's been our search. Now you could, as I suggested, just stack up every actuarial bit of facticity you could and troll through it to hope to snag something. You could have a slightly more hypothesis-driven view. Maybe it's the rurals versus the urbans. Maybe it's all those people out in the bush, or all those people who've lost or been separated by their culture by living in urban situations. That's not a bad working assumption, but it doesn't work. It correlates zero with these dramatically different levels of youth suicide. You could also talk about SES, socioeconomic standing, poverty. And I know Tom talked to some about this, and I don't mean to demean poverty as a potential causal factor in Indigenous suicide, but from the point of view of a researcher, all these communities are essentially equally dirt poor. And the first thing you get to know in Statistics 101 is that nothing correlates with unity. You know, so if everybody's the same, it can't possibly correlate with anything like suicidality. One needs to be idea-driven. One needs to go in with a working assumption, and my working assumption has been that cultural wounds need cultural medicine. And so in a sense, in the language of kind of upstream, downstream causation, I'm trying to move as far upstream as I can to try to search out what we've come to describe too poetically as the cause of causes. And I think the end game in that, with reference to suicide, is that the cause of causes in the case of youth suicide and many other issues that bear upon the burden of proof of the burden of ill health in Indigenous people is cultural distress. Okay? So our task then has been to try to seek out possible measures of cultural continuity, because we're looking for things that somehow earmark the fact that some communities are ahead of others in having a tether back to their past, strengthening their past, rehabilitating their past, owning their past, and also in a more forward-looking way, communities that have achieved a greater success in having community control of their own future. So here's a short list of such things. It's hard to come up with such a list because in this kind of game numbers game that I'm playing, you have to have markers of health and ill health, or social determinants of health in this case, that you can collect on each and every band. So there's some very promising things that we could have chosen, but we can only get it on a fraction of the people. So that list is meant to break, it's in no particular order, but there are some things that are clearly have to do with owning your traditional past. In some kind of index having to do with knowledge preservation is one such thing. It's not a measure of social capital. There's no money to be made in retaining your language, your Indigenous language, but it turns out that it's a marker of the efforts on the part of communities to preserve their past. You could say the same thing about the committing community resources to building cultural facilities, museums, or community centers, or things where rituals are performed and culture is preserved. Things like litigating with the government for title to traditional land, or struggling to achieve some measure of self-government, or interestingly, restoring women to positions of power in government. With initial contact with Western European colonizers, the women were simply that no one would talk to them. And so women were demoted from their very powerful positions in Indigenous communities. These are matrilineal communities. And now communities have successfully restored some part of that lost political power to women. But there are other things that have to do with owning your own future, having some measure of control over your educational delivery system, your health delivery system, your child protection system, your policing and jural systems. So these are all stabs, hopefully not stabs in the dark, about trying to find things that we can measure across 203 communities that are indexical somehow of cultural continuity, owning the cultural past, and having a sense of control of the future. I'll just kind of breeze past these next two, which simply show that each and every one of those factors, as we have come to call them, are themselves independently correlated with suicide rates. Here's the take-home slide. What this shows, this is the first wave in our data collection in which there, initially we had only 6 of these measures and we've added 3 along the way. But in the first of these waves of data, what this shows you, we just counted up how many of these protective factors each community has. So you could have them all or none, and it turns out that every community has all 6 of that list, has no suicides, and every one that goes missing, the suicide rate goes up, so that if you have none of those factors, you have a suicide rate 150 times the national average. Okay? There's another one, I won't dwell on it, it's just a later wave of data using all 9 of those variables. And if I had time, I would go on and say 2 more things. That's a trick I often play on. One of them I actually have said enough about, and it's just an attempt to say that in terms of policy action implications, that if there's variability out there, and I promise you that anything you look at in terms of the health and well-being of Indigenous communities, if you look broadly across the range of communities of concern, you will find variability. It may not go from 0 suicides to 3,000 times the national average, but there will be variability. And that lets you know that there is strength in communities, there's strength on the ground, and that makes it possible to envision a strength-based intervention strategy. The last point is really about what might such a strength-based intervention strategy look like. And here I draw your attention to things that all of the other speakers have talked about, that at least in Canada historically, what happens is that a bunch of people in our Ottawa and your Canberra, I'm supposing, get together in some kind of dark room and think of the 199th new program in a 200-year history, and then that's parachuted into the lands of individual people, and it never works. Okay, it doesn't. That's too strong. It almost never works. But money is squandered, and that's Fiona's strong language, I think. But what we know from this kind of research is that there is Indigenous knowledge sedimented into those communities that are doing well. We know it's there on the basis of hard evidence because the communities don't have the problem. Every community that has no suicides knows how to run a community in such a way that the kids there think that life is worth living. Okay? We need to learn to transfer that Indigenous knowledge, not in some top-down fashion, but laterally across communities, from communities that have less strength to communities that have more. So I know I've taken way too much of your time. Thank you.